Okay, so this week, we're in the second part of a pretty new series, still pretty new at this point. It's called Unfair, Illogical, and Completely Unexpected. And now if this is your first week joining us, or if it's your first week being with us in this series, where we started last week was basically taking a look at life, right? Life over the past 2 years, maybe, or maybe even before that for you, and probably at some point in the future. And we talked about how really, in a lot of ways, life has felt unfair. We weren't getting what we deserved. It's felt at times illogical. It just didn't make sense. And things often were completely unexpected. In fact, I think right now, people are even at a point where we're almost kind of anticipating the unexpected. And if you've been interacting with people, you probably have noticed that after this long, people have started to get bitter, angry, burnt out, and hard. Maybe you've even felt yourself getting like that. I know I've felt myself, my fuse shortening a little bit. We're a little bit less patient, a little less likely to go with the flow, right? And so the question is like, well, do we have any choice, or are we just stuck with that? Is there something we can do? And I introduced you to someone, you've probably heard of him before. His name's the Apostle Paul. And this guy was extremely influential. He did things all over the world. He started more churches than probably anybody, or at least more significant churches than probably anybody when this thing was first getting off the ground. And you wouldn't know it from the way he talked about life, but his life was so stinking hard. Like, he was beaten several different times by people who he once really respected. He was abandoned. We talked about the fact that he was shipwrecked 3, maybe 4 times. I mean, think about that. If you've been shipwrecked, you are the friend who has been shipwrecked. He was shipwrecked several times, and it's a footnote in his story, right? Things were just so tough. And yet this guy was the guy who said things like, I've learned how to be content, always. He's the guy who said, rejoice always. He's the one who, when we talked about worry a few weeks ago, he's the one who wrote that passage. He's like, don't be anxious about anything. Like, time and time again, he just had the ability to see good in life. He was able to avoid becoming bitter, angry, burnt out, and hard, even though his days were so tough, and his life just got harder and harder and harder, until eventually it was taken from him. And so I don't know about you, but like, I hear that and I'm like, all right, like, what's going on there, right? Is he just lost his mind? Or is there something that he has that I don't? Is there something he gets that I don't quite get? And fortunately for Paul, because he's written so many letters, we often get a little glimpse into what's going on in his mind. And he tells us what he attributes all of this to. He says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. He says, his grace to me was not without effect. Like, it really made a difference. It motivated him. It helped him in his weakness. It helped him deal with his failures. It helped him turn his life around. And he attributed all of it to like God's grace. Now, again, I don't know about you, but that's one of those words for me. I'm like, grace? Like, what? What is that? Maybe it's, you say grace before a meal, right? Or your mom has a friend named Grace. Or maybe especially if you've been in the church for a long time, you hear the word grace and you think forgiveness, right? And there's definitely some truth to that. Forgiveness is definitely a part of grace, but it's so much bigger than that. So much bigger. In fact, forgiveness itself doesn't really have the ability, for me at least, to do everything that Paul said grace did for him. And so we backed up and we took a bigger picture and we said grace really is, or at least the theological textbook definition of grace is unmerited favor, which are 2 words we don't use. But unmerited, meaning like there's everything you do. There's the good, the bad, like the okay, the resume, all of this here. And then there's favor, like God's favor for you. Totally independent, not even necessarily in spite of, though probably, but totally independent. Like, you can't do it, you can't change it, you can't do anything to get it, you can't do anything to lose it. And then there's this like favor that God has for you. And again, we don't really use the term favor anymore unless you're asking for a favor. But the idea of favor is think about, this isn't a perfect explanation, but think about the way you feel about someone who is your favorite. You want good for them. You want to see them prosper. You want them to thrive. You're in their corner. You're especially interested in them. And that's the idea of how God sees us. He's especially interested in you. He wants to see you prosper. There's this attitude, one theologian says it's an attitude of loving kindness and it's totally free and unchangeable. Like he just cares. He just cares. And it's not just for you, it's for all of us, right? And so we said to give it like a different way of looking at it, we said grace is the idea that God is in your corner and there's nothing you can do to get him out because you didn't do anything to get him in. In your corner. In your corner, like that's, and does that include forgiveness? Absolutely. But it's so much more than that, right? So that's grace, like big overarching thing. And what we said is like, the more we understand that, the more likely it is that no matter how hard life gets, no matter how unfair, illogical, or unexpected life is, like the more we understand God's grace for us, the more likely it is that we'll be able to avoid becoming bitter, angry, burnt out, and hard. Jesus was, John, one of his friends, described him as full of grace and truth. Like the embodiment of, that's the essence of his character. It's his glory, full of grace and truth. And so he is this concrete example we have of what grace actually looks like. And so what we said last week is that we're gonna look at these different situations, see what grace with a face looks like concrete, what it actually looks like to have God in your corner. And I think that will change the way that we see him. Today, we're looking at a story that maybe you've heard before. And some of these stories, especially been in church for a while, maybe you've heard them before, but if we like look at them with fresh lens, I think you'll see a different side of grace. So that's where we are. Here's a question for you. Have you ever heard of a porch pirate? Yeah, okay, they're the people, if you don't know, they're the people that steal your Amazon packages before you can bring them in, right? So my son and I, we like to watch fail videos online. Sometimes I just come home from work and he's like, let's put on the funny videos. That means let's watch people fall. And so we just watch all these fails. We watch people break expensive things. It really is very therapeutic. But there's this one where there's this man. He looks like a dad. You know, he's got a fanny pack, he's got a baseball hat, but he's a porch pirate. And he walks up to this like house and he gets to the front and he picks up a huge box, no cars in the driveway, picks up this box, gets up, all of a sudden the front door flies open. There's a guy who's like, hey. And the guy, he just looks there. He's got this face, like look on his face like he's just seen a ghost. He's like, and he doesn't run. And then he starts to explain himself. He's like, I'm with UPS. I'm part of an auditing process. I'm auditing. And he goes, Google it. Just Google it. Mike Hansen. And then he just like drops it and like takes off. And I'm like, man, you've been caught. Just like whatever. Get off the driveway. So think about this. Have you ever been caught? Maybe you're not a porch pirate. Have you ever been found out? Have you ever been just like caught red-handed or turned in or told on? I remember when I was in school, like this phrase that struck fear into my soul was when someone would look at me in school and be like, that's it, I'm telling. You know, I was like, even now, I just don't like to think about it. Oh yeah, you said that, you know what? That's it, I'm telling. And I'm gonna go tell the teacher. And you know what, grown-ups did this too. My lunch monitor would be like, oh, you think that's it? I'm telling your teacher. And it would just like go up the ladder. And even the teacher would be like, oh, that's it, I'm telling principal. And then, you know, the principal would be like, that's it, I'm calling home. And then it got real, you know? And then my mom would be like, well, that's it, I'm telling dad. And we just go up the ladder. And this wasn't like just one event, but it was like whenever someone wanted to, it's like it got higher and higher. And the higher we got on the ladder, the harder the hammer came down, you know? And I don't know about you, I don't know what your experience was like growing up, but for me, in my mind, this is when God entered the conversation, you know? Like, I'm a mess. The higher up we go on the ladder, the more likely God is to be part of the music I have to face. When I've done something wrong, when I've fallen on my face, when I've dug the hole myself and fallen in it, right? When it's completely, that's when God enters the conversation. And maybe you've had a situation similar to this where it's like, oh yeah, you're having a good, you know what? You broke all the rules, you didn't get, now you're going to that like faith school, you know? Like now you're gonna be fine without the Bible, but now you're gonna get it because you're in trouble, right? Or maybe you were sent to church or someplace because it was a hammer that was coming down on the way you were acting. For me, when God got in the conversation at that point, it was like over for me. You know, it was like that was the moment when my situation, you know, hit the fan. And so the question is this the way it's supposed to be? He's right. The question is, where does God stand? For real. When you have failed, when you've been found out, when you've blown it, and it's your fault, when you've messed up, maybe your marriage is falling apart, maybe your home's falling, maybe you lost your job, but if we're being honest, you know it's your fault. You did this. Where does God stand? Does he really want us to see him as the hammer that comes down? And what does grace look like in this situation? John was an early follower of Jesus, and he wrote down a lot of the stuff later on in life. He watched very carefully and wrote it down later so we could read about it. And he records a situation of someone who has just been totally found out, totally exposed, and this person did it to themselves. You might have heard this story, but again, try to like hear it for the first time, all right? So it says, at dawn, he appeared. This he is Jesus. And appeared, he didn't like poof. He just made an appearance. He appeared again in the temple courts, which was the center of teaching. It was the center of religious life, where all the people gathered around him. He's famous at this point. People are coming to listen to him teach. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, these are the religious authorities. These are the respected and liked even people in the religious community. They brought in a woman caught in adultery. She had cheated on her spouse and she was caught. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women." Literally, like this is the ancient world. Things were pretty brutal. Like literally they could throw stones at her until she died. This was one of the ways they tried to kill Paul. This was a way that you can execute someone. But they ask him, they say, well, now what do you say? And John gives us a little behind the scenes look here. He says they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. They knew people wanted to come listen to Jesus and they didn't like the attention he was getting. And so they're trying to make him look bad. And they're like, all right, let's put this woman in front of him and see what he does. See what he does. Now, stop for a second. Think about this. This is rough, right? Think about it. If you're listening, and especially if you've heard this before, who in your mind is the victim in this story? Who's the one we feel bad for? Who's the one who's like, you know, your heart goes out to? For me, it's always the woman, you know? They're making an example out of her. And that's true. There's some funny business going on here. These religious teachers are trying to leverage this situation, put Jesus in a difficult spot. But this isn't like so great, this situation. Like, where's the man? You know, it takes two to do what she did. Where's he? And so things don't look so right, like right off the bat. But if you're there that day, like if you're sitting next to John and you're watching, he's like, oh, what's Jesus gonna do, right? And you're sitting there and you were raised in the area and at the time that Jesus and John were raised, you would have been very familiar with their ancient religious text, the Torah, or what we have and we call the Old Testament. And in there is this ongoing metaphor, especially in a book called Proverbs. And the metaphor is a metaphor for sin, which is like a word, right? The metaphor is a metaphor for sin, and it's illustrated in the form of an adulterous woman. Now, maybe you hear that and you're like, okay, that's pretty messed up. Why does it have to be a woman, right? Well, in the book of Proverbs, there's actually two ongoing metaphors. One is wisdom, who calls out. And if you listen to her and if you find her, good things happen, right? The other thing is the adulterous woman, who also calls out, and there's temptation, but this will come back to bite you. Wisdom is also a woman in this book, so there's two parallel metaphors. They're both female. They're not necessarily saying anything about men or women in this situation. However, my point is, if you're there with John, right, and you were in Jesus' class, and you're sitting there, and you're like, I remember when we learned about this. There is the woman who is the metaphorical image of sin. She's right in front of you. And so this is a big deal. Not only that, but Jesus would say something later that indicates that this woman was living a lifestyle of things like this. In other words, this wasn't like a one-time whoops. This was either she had done this before or she was doing things that eventually led her to this place. And so if you're sitting there in this very rules-oriented society and you're listening, you're like, yeah, well, she really does deserve to be in this situation. She brought this on herself. She made this mess. Her husband's suspicions are confirmed. Especially back then, lineage was huge in ancient Israel. It was a huge part of who they were. And so for her to break the whole lineage that she was part of and be with, that was huge. It was a huge mistake for them back then. And so they're like, yeah, she really is getting what she has coming to her. She's not necessarily the person everybody's heart goes out to because she did this to herself. And this really for us is a good picture of this whole idea of sin. Sin, the word sin, we cringe when we hear it, right? But really, it's one of those terms that needs to be defined. Most of us, when we hear sin, we think well, that's when you make, the big power-hungry dictator up there who makes all the rules. That's when you break one of his rules. He doesn't like when we break his rules, He's just wants us to do what he says because he's big and we're small. But the way the New Testament writers describe sin is something that leads to death. Death being could be literal death, could be the death of a relationship. It's the most negative metaphorical image that they have. They're it just never, ever leads to a good place. It will come back to bite you. It will hurt you. The teaching is not that you should worry about what sin God is going to do to you when you sin. The teaching is that you should worry about what sin is going to do to you when you sin. Because it's toxic. We did an entire series on this when we first started called Detox, where we just talked about how all this stuff comes back to hurt you. But we have it flipped around. We think God is this cosmic killjoy that's just out to stop us from having fun. But it's the exact opposite. He cares, and so he has put things in place for us to protect us. When I was younger, there was this road right by my house, this busy road called Pond Path, And that was the road I wasn't allowed on. And the problem was that 7-Eleven was also on Pond Path. And to a kid in elementary school, 7-Eleven was just the best place in the world. They got a whole aisle with every candy you could think of. They got medium sizes. They've got the bags, Then there's Slurpees. There's chips. There's those things on the greasy metal rollers, It's like a hamburger, but it looks like a hot dog. And it's it's anything you could want, but it's just over on Pond Path. I'm not allowed over there. And okay, I went all the time. And I did it afraid of what was going to happen when my parents find out. So one day, someone's going to drive past and be like, oh, I saw your son on Pond Path. He's allowed on Pond Path. Right? And I was just I know one day they're going to find out, and the hammer's going to drop. I'm going to be in so much trouble, but, let's see how many Slurpees I can get before the gig's up, right? And so I would just keep going. One day, I found out that someone from my school got hit by a car on Pond Path. And if it weren't for his helmet, he would have lost his life. And all of a sudden at that point, it was okay, so maybe I shouldn't avoid Pond Path because of what my dad might do. Maybe I should avoid Pond Path because of what Pond Path might do to me. And that is how we have to understand sin, not as something that God's like angry about. There's a song by Johnny Cash. It's called God's Gonna Cut You Down. And it's like, it is so out of whack. It's got a nice jingle. Johnny Cash is great, right? But this song is so out of whack. There's a line, it's like, tell the long-tongued liar, God's gonna cut you down. One day he's gonna get you. You just wait. Once he stops doing whatever he's doing, he finally has time, he'll come, he's gonna get you. Just wait. And it's like, you don't have to, we should tell the long-tongued liar that one day he's gonna grow old and have no meaningful relationships because nobody trusts him. That's what we should tell him. Not that God's gonna cut you down, right? So the idea, and here, back to our story, right? We have this woman who is in a mess. Her reputation is ruined. She might be about to lose her life. We don't know the state of her family. There's a brokenhearted husband somewhere, maybe two families involved in this. She is in a mess, and at that moment, she's faced with the magnitude of what she's done in that moment. And what Jesus does next is not fair. It doesn't make perfect sense and no one sees it coming. It's grace. And so here's how Jesus handles it. They say, what do we do with her? And so Jesus, he bends down and starts to write on the ground with his finger. Nobody knows what he's doing here. If anyone tries to tell you they know what he's doing, they're full of baloney. But he just starts doodling on the ground. We don't know what he's writing. They keep bugging him. It says, when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, maybe you've heard this before. He said, all right, you want to talk about stoning her? Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And then he goes back to his doodle. It says again, he stooped down and wrote in the sand. At this, John writes, those who heard began to go away. One at a time, the oldest ones first, the oldest ones being most aware of their shortcomings. It says, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And they have a conversation. Jesus straightened up and asked her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. And then he says something interesting. He says, go now and leave your life of sin. This was no one-time mistake. A lot of mistakes that led up to this moment. And so think about this. Does Jesus drop the hammer on her? He doesn't. He doesn't. And he had the grounds to. He could have. People would not have faulted him if he did. In fact, John is making a point here. Everyone walks away. Everyone who is with sin walks away. Jesus, we believe, is the only one who was without sin, so he's the only one left standing there. He could if he wanted to, but he didn't. He chooses not to condemn her. Some of us live as if he did. Some of us live as if God is just waiting. Like everybody warned you to stop. Everybody warned you this isn't gonna end up the way. And finally, it's time to pay the piper. Finally, the gig is up. You've been caught red-handed. Now you gotta face Jesus. And what does he do? He doesn't condemn her. He doesn't condemn her. This is the picture here of grace. However, he also doesn't pretend like it didn't happen. Like that's the other end of the spectrum. And some of us live there where it's like, God doesn't care. He's just up there like, yeah, have a good time. Like he's some old, nice grandpa, like, whatever you want. As long as you kids are having fun, eat as much candy as you want, right? Like, no, if what we said about sin is true, then that would not be something that a loving God would do. And so Jesus says, go and leave your life of sin. He doesn't say no big deal. She knows, she has seen the mess that this has created. And he says, so go, forget this, leave it behind. The idea here, this is the idea of grace. It's not just forgiveness, right? It's the idea of him being in her corner. Right? If you were Jesus and she were someone that you cared about, someone whose corner you were in, maybe if you're a parent, it's your own daughter, maybe it's your sister, right? If it's you there and you're in their corner, No, you're not going to condemn her. You're not going to be the final blow. But you're also not going to pretend it doesn't happen. You're going to try and get her through this. You know, I mentioned before that everybody leaves except Jesus because Jesus was the only one without sin, right? And so that the point there is that John's trying to make a point. He's trying to show you Jesus could have if he wanted to, but he didn't. However, the picture, what we see is everyone gone. Let's put that verse back up there. It says, at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. Remember this? The older ones first until, look at this, until only Jesus was left with the woman. With the woman. Everyone's gone, and Jesus is still with her. Where does God stand? Where does God stand when you are at your worst? When you've done it to yourself? When you hit rock bottom? When you've been found out? When your marriage falls apart? When your career falls apart? And really, if you're honest, at least part of it is your fault. Maybe all of it is your fault. Where does he stand? With you. Maybe everyone else is gone. Maybe everyone else has forgotten you. Maybe no one else has, where he's with you. If it were me, if it were my daughter there, no, I wouldn't like accept I wouldn't cheer her on and say, oh, it's fine, I hope it works out between you and one of those guys. But I would want her to know I'm with her. If her family has left her, if her husband doesn't have time for her, like I would want her to know she could come home running and I'm gonna be there. When you are at your absolute worst, he's still there with us. He's still there with you. I'm telling you, if you make a huge mistake, and maybe you have, maybe you get to a point where the people you trust, the people you respect, the people you love, they're like, no, we're done with you. And they walk away. Maybe it's and you feel alone. I'm telling you, if you don't know that this is what grace looks like, if you feel like God is gone with them, that could crush you. But if you know that even at your worst, even when you've made the mess, even when you're not yet willing to admit you made the mess, he's still there with you. Like, okay, fine, but we'll get through this. That's what has the ability to turn everything around. That's what has the ability to help you find strength in weakness, to bounce back, to know that he's not condemning, not condoning, but not condemning. I'm with you. I'm with you. That's the power of grace. Grace, God with you. God with you. There's another side to this coin, though, especially if you're someone who's been in church for a long time. If you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, the question for you is, where do you stand when someone else's situation hits the fan? Like we are first recipients of God's grace, that unmerited favor. But from there, we're invited to follow him in showing that unmerited favor to other people, to have a special interest for other people. And so when everyone else has walked out, and maybe it's someone in your family, maybe it's one relative in your family, you know exactly who it is. You're like, yeah, he's got these things. He does it all the time. And we all tell him, you gotta stop. And maybe people are starting to walk away. I'm not saying you have to accept the behavior, but does that person know that you're with them? How good are you at showing someone who you don't agree with or whose choices, lifestyle, beliefs, whatever, that you are against? How good are you showing them that you're for them? That's the idea. That's the idea here. The scary thing to me, honestly, about this story is the fact that the religious teachers here, there's some messed up stuff going on. But these religious teachers, they believe that they're standing for God by standing against this woman. And the church has been doing that forever. Literally waging war in church history, like leaving a wake of victims behind thinking We're for God. Where do you stand in this circle? I'm going to call the band up, but I'll leave you with this story. So years ago, I was working as a youth leader at a church, and there was a girl who came from a family, and things were a little bit rough at home. Her mom wasn't always around, and she had a sister, and the two of them, no church background, started coming to our youth group, our high school program. And it was great. They plugged in, they made great friends, but after a little while, one of them stopped coming. And so we waited a few weeks, and eventually the sister would still come. And I reached out to her, and I was like, hey, is everything okay? What's going on? And at first, she didn't want to tell us. But eventually, she said, okay, she's pregnant. And she's afraid of what you're going to say or of what other people in the church are going to say. And my first question was, why? Of course I wouldn't suggest that these teenagers go out and start having babies. But if that happens, what has been said to make her think that we're not for her? And at that moment, I was faced with two hard questions. The first one was, have I said anything that has made her believe that she's not welcome here if she does something? There's something that could get me, us, the church out of her corner. The other thing, but I couldn't help but think about, is the fact that the church's reputation for being judgmental is not just inconvenient, it's dangerous. And now we have someone who needs people in her corner, and she's afraid to even go near the church. Fortunately, we were able to get in contact with her, and she felt like our group was supporting her. A little while later, there was an older woman from the church, several older women who had been in the church for a long time who found out about this situation with the girl, that a girl in our youth group was pregnant. And those women decided to get together and throw a huge baby shower for her at the church. And that day, I was proud to be part of that church, because I think that's what Jesus would have done. It might have been a little messy, they could have had reasons to not do it. They could have come up with reasons why, well, maybe we shouldn't be part of that, or maybe someone else can, or maybe we don't do it at the church. But they jumped right in, like Jesus jumped right in to say, hey, forget, we're with you, and we're going to walk you through this. Grace is God in your corner. There's nothing you can do to get him out. It's God with you at your worst, when you fail, when you've been found out, turned in, told on, when there's a mess you've made yourself. He's with you.